5 years ago, I left Erick. Later, he won the Best Actor award, but at the Bexstar Awards Ceremony, he held up a photo of me and said, "My lover has been missing for a month. Please help me find her." The news of my death in 2018 had been reported countless times, but Erick, devastated, had lost his memory, forgetting everything about what happened after I died. The day his agent announced that Erick would indefinitely withdraw from the industry, news of Erick's attempted suicide broke. Chapter 1. My name, alongside Erick's, was trending again. It all started when 32-year-old Erick won the Best Actor award at the Bexstar Awards for his movie Daylight Revelry. He expressed how difficult his journey had been, and then, to everyone's surprise, he took out an old, yellowed photo. In the video, Erick looked directly at the camera, his flawless face carrying a hint of helplessness as he said, "But everyone, my lover ran off in a fit of anger a month ago. I'd appreciate it if you could help me find her. Her name is Lisa." Erick's voice was so calm. It was as if he was indulging a playful child. It almost seemed like another level of enviable public display of affection. But the guests at the awards ceremony were all stunned, because everyone knew about the heinous knife attack at a city airport in 2018, carried out by a criminal with antisocial tendencies. I died on the spot, protecting a child who had been separated from their family. Afterward, my name stayed in the trending searches for a month, and, naturally, so did Erick's name. People dug up the fact that Erick and I had been together for 25 years, that our families were neighbors when we were little, and that we were childhood sweethearts. They found snippets of our love story in the vlogs Erick posted on his Weibo. Remembering Lisa after my death, time always quietly washes things away, making them blurry. After 5 years, everyone thought Erick was okay again, even though he lost 30 pounds in a month after I died. Even though he developed depression 6 months later, even though Erick attempted suicide 6 times, each time being stopped by his agent, Paul, but eventually, he seemed to get better. In the second year, when spring was in full bloom, Erick returned to Weibo for the first time in a year, posting a selfie, taking half an hour to type 16 words. "I'm Erick. Paul told me, it's best to see spring when you're healed." And Erick's fans logged on in droves. "Bro, you're finally back. So, bro, you're going to eat well today and gain some weight, right? The hot pot in Chongqing is really delicious." Among them, there were even some comments from rival fans. "The great actor ran out of money, didn't he? And what about Lisa? Mr. Devoted, will you still remember her?" In the blink of an eye, this comment was buried under countless others, as people indignantly defended Erick. But unexpectedly, Erick saw it. He replied, "Why wouldn't I remember Lisa?" Sometimes words seem emotionless, unable to truly convey a person's thoughts and actions. It seemed bold at first glance, but in reality, on the other side of the screen, Erick's gaze was as lost as a child's. He asked Paul the same question. Paul's throat tightened, and, as always, he lied through his teeth. "It's just a rival fan, brain dead. No morals. Spouting nonsense." The psychologist had told him that Erick's depression wasn't cured. It was as if he had developed some form of early Alzheimer's symptoms. He subconsciously chose to forget what he wanted to forget. Over the past year, through depression and self-harm, he had unknowingly developed a defense mechanism for when he was unhappy. This meant that sometimes Erick would be fine, and other times he would forget. Right now, he is in one of his extremely sorrowful phases. Paul had worked alongside Erick for years, and he genuinely felt for this man who had grown up with so much loss yet was so sentimental. So, he had once asked the psychologist sincerely, what would make him happier? The answer was to let him do what he was good at, acting. At first, Paul had worried about it, but he later realized those worries were unnecessary because every time Erick arrived at a new set and got his script, he automatically immersed himself in his role, acting with dedication and professionalism. There were, however, 2 incidents over the past few years. The first was 3 years ago when Erick played a professional killer. During a scene where a diligent young actor acted terrified, Erick suddenly burst into tears. The set was thrown into chaos. Paul had taken Erick into the break room. Sweat poured down Erick's face, his expression full of anxiety. It was as if he had gone back to the day I died. Erick, pale-faced, bit his lips until they bled. Paul couldn't do anything to ease his pain, so he stayed with him. After about 3 hours, in that small room where dim light filtered in, Erick suddenly reached out his hand, trying to touch the scarce light. Paul thought he would forget everything again, so he asked him about me. But instead, Erick asked another question. Paul, is the child Lisa saved that day okay? Paul had seen that child. The parents had always wanted to meet Erick. He didn't plan on hiding it. He's fine. The child is in middle school now. Erick lowered his lashes and nodded, his voice hoarse. That's good. Paul could only sigh and pat his shoulder. In the next moment, the man who pretended to be strong suddenly let down all his defenses, becoming as fragile as grass, his tears blurring as they fell, the pain evident. But what about my Lisa? Erick's throat tightened. Lisa? And I could only watch, feeling even more powerless than he did. Chapter 2. The second incident happened at the award ceremony. On Weibo, there were more than a dozen trending topics about Erick and me, all of them blowing up, reflecting on Erick's 12 years as an actor. From the very beginning, he publicly shared my name on Weibo. His manager, Paul, had urged him to think about his career and to hide our relationship, but he stubbornly refused. In his second year, he acted in a low-budget drama, which unexpectedly became a hit. His follower count skyrocketed overnight by hundreds of thousands, and along with it, new fans soon noticed Erick's pinned post, which said, "Lover, Lisa." That discouraged many of the new fans, and I once privately worried about Erick's future, feeling conflicted about whether we should break up. However, as soon as I sent Erick a breakup message on WeChat, tears streaming down my face, Erick came into the room with his camera to take pictures of me. He took great delight in snapping my embarrassing photos, and I, infuriated, chased him wearing my slippers. "You're crazy. Why are you taking pictures of me?" Chasing him around, I eventually collapsed in exhaustion. Erick, rather annoyingly, would lie down next to me and say seriously, "My dear Miss Lisa, you don't need to shed tears over how special you are to me. I'm famous because of my dedication and talent, not because I avoid relationships." I called him narcissistic and conceited. But the next day, Erick updated his pinned post. Late at night, he wrote a whole 10,000 words. He described in detail our love story, saying we'd known each other for 20 years. He wrote about how, when we were little, Erick had passed out on the way to the police station after being abused at home, and I timidly followed him and ended up saving him. After that, Erick's parents were charged with domestic violence and sentenced. His grandfather never liked him, and seeing my parents' kindness, he handed Erick over to our family. So, he became a part of our household. My parents raised him, and while I was pure-hearted for 20 years, Erick secretly developed feelings for me. On the day the college entrance exams ended, it was Erick's birthday. My parents were on a business trip, and I had put my heart into arranging everything for his birthday. But once the lights went out, Erick confessed his feelings to me. I still remember that scene, the soft glow of the lights, the faint scent of the cake, and the pale-skinned boy with his eyes closed, making a wish with devotion. Erick was always good-looking, even as a child. So, I was stunned for a moment. He blew out the candles and opened his eyes, and our gazes just happened to meet. My heart thumped so loudly, it was deafening. "Did you make a wish?" I snapped out of it, blinking nervously as I asked him. "Yeah, I did." I never asked about his wishes, but since I couldn't find anything else to say, I impulsively asked what he had wished for. That night, I was as naive as a lamb to the slaughter. Erick's throat bobbed. He wished for his wish to come true. So, unable to contain his feelings any longer, he looked at me with such devotion. "Lisa, can we be together?" Naturally, I was too young and confused, so I rejected him. After getting into university, we purposely chose different cities, thinking it would be our chance to fully go our separate ways. But then, the next year, Erick got into a car accident. During the spring festival, my parents were busy socializing in another city, leaving me and a nurse to take care of him. Erick remained silent, and I ignored him too. On New Year's Eve, the nurse went home to celebrate. Fireworks lit up the night, and I excitedly wheeled Erick out to the balcony. Before we could ring in the new year, a soft voice spoke from behind. "Why won't you let me see the fireworks?" His tone carried a hint of dejection. I let out a startled huh, and just then, the sky exploded with fireworks. As I looked at the fireworks, I could hardly contain my joy. Erick, however, was only sneaking glances at me. When the noise subsided, I noticed and awkwardly rubbed my nose while staring at the ground, my toes shuffling against it. But then my forehead was lifted. Under the night sky, Erick looked worn and wounded, his voice hoarse. "Lisa, do you hate me that much?" Being a kind-hearted person, I quickly said, no, and scrambled to explain that I was just embarrassed. Not that I hated him. Erick pressed his lips together in thought. "But you never said yes." One sentence, and I felt my feet nervously digging into the ground, as if building a castle to hide in. The next time we met was in our 3rd year of college. All of my roommates had coupled up, leaving me as the only single one. They were all acting like best friends, showing me profiles of their brothers at home like they were treasures, and one even made a PPT presentation. The terrifying world of social anxiety. During the Dragon Boat Festival, I was feeling troubled, and Erick just happened to deliver some zongzi that my mom had made. I pulled him over and cheerfully introduced him to my roommates. "Look, this is my boyfriend." I even pinched him, just in case he gave us away. Erick, a natural actor, played the role well. He couldn't hide the smile tugging at his lips and even offered to invite everyone to the Drama Academy for 3 days over the holiday. My roommates abandoned their boyfriends in favor of handsome guys and pretty girls. Erick and I pretended to be a couple for 3 days. On the last day, Erick treated everyone to dinner. That night, after everyone had eaten and drunk their fill, I was the only one completely sober. Erick had shown an intense possessiveness, not allowing me to drink. After I finally managed to send my dear roommates off, Erick, conveniently drunk, collapsed onto me, casually dropping his apartment keys. I accused him of harassment, but his eyes, so beautiful, reddened by the alcohol, made his trembling lashes even more alluring. "Are you just going to watch me die without saving me?" he asked. "All right." I was entranced. The next year, Erick and I were officially together. After graduation, Erick frequently auditioned and took acting roles. I remember during the 3rd year, he landed a small role with just 5 scenes. We celebrated all night. I told him that his future was bright. In the 4th year, Paul discovered him, and with a stroke of luck, Erick became popular after starring in a low-budget indie film. So, in the long post he wrote later, he concluded with, "I won't discard the shoes that have taken me on this long journey, nor forget the mud she cleaned off them countless times. And I won't lose my original intent just for fame. My original intent is Lisa. I have loved her for so many years." That's why Erick was known as the first person to openly date at the peak of his fame. I read his statement, moved to tears, and posted on my moments with a bit of a teasing undertone, nicely written. "But who said I'm your shoes?" Erick helplessly replied, "Me." Over the years, Erick unwaveringly fulfilled his promise. He loved filming and often turned our life into vlogs for his fans. I became known as the luckiest sister-in-law in the entertainment world, and people said we were both rare creatures. Some even spent the entire night digging into our history, leaving comments on my page. "Sister, if you two break up, I will never believe in love again." Chapter 3. That day, I was planning to reply, but then, Erick ended up in the hospital late at night because of his stomach problems. I rushed there in such a hurry that I forgot my phone. Paul tried to comfort me, saying, "It's nothing serious, he's just gotten too into his role lately and hasn't been eating enough." We had fought about this a few times. Actually, it was more like I was the only one fighting. Erick would agree to all my demands, and after a while, it felt insincere. So that early morning, after Erick was stabilized within 4, I went home, sulking, and sent him a message. "Hello. This time, I'm not going to be easily coaxed." Erick replied quickly, "Where to?" We often argued, and after each fight, I would usually leave to clear my head. This time was no different, and Erick was used to it by now. He even helped me pick a place. Milan has nice scenery, and there's a hotel I stayed at when I was filming there. "You should go. I'll come find you after I wrap up in a couple of days." I told him I wasn't going. Then, the flight to Milan would arrive on time at 7 p.m. I sent Erick a photo of the plane ticket. But in the next moment, everything felt like an absurd dream. The child cried hysterically. The deranged killer, with a blood-stained knife, turned his red-eyed gaze on him. The entire airport was in a state of panic. And in my panic, I grabbed the child, pulling him into my arms to shield him. The atmosphere fell into an unbearable silence. Pain and death surrounded me without mercy. A few more strikes. My breaths grew shallow. The child's big tears fell, and he called me sister. I touched his head and collapsed to the ground. At the same time, the police restrained the deranged killer. That day, all of Weibo exploded in chaos. Countless people mourned me late into the night, crying bitterly. Erick's face was drained of color, tense as he saw my body covered with a white sheet. His hands shook, but he didn't dare uncover it. In the end, he still pulled back the sheet. The space felt starkly white. Erick, like a shattered porcelain doll, was utterly devastated. He kept backing away, lips trembling, until he collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. He called my name, though no sound actually came out. I could hear it, Erick's broken voice, filled with unbearable pain, word by word. It felt like he was swallowing blades as he said, "Lisa, please, don't be mad anymore, okay? Come back, please. I won't do anything. I'll just stay with you. I'll eat on time. I'll go to Milan with you." Paul and Erick's team all burst into tears. The sadness was like a massive tornado, silently sweeping through the entire nation. That day, many people on Weibo were calling for me to come back. Even the trolls were there. "Lisa, stop the act and come back." They also dug up the truth. Erick had actually planned a grand proposal in a small town in Milan, at my intended destination, inviting our friends and people from the industry. Everyone knew, everyone except me. I felt cold all over, while Erick refused to accept my death. Like a stubborn child, he tried to pull me back up, using the warmth of his arms to warm me, insisting that I wake up. On the day of my cremation, my mom took the opportunity when Erick had collapsed after not eating or drinking for 3 days. When he woke up, I was already a pile of ashes. He held my urn, his fingers turning purple from the pressure, but he controlled his strength, not wanting to hurt me. "Lisa, are you lying to me? Why won't you talk to me?" His eyes were bloodshot as he muttered to the urn that could no longer respond. Later, in the vast ocean, he slowly let me go. Seagulls flew freely. Dolphins swam in formation. Yet Erick still wouldn't let me go. In the end, it was my mom who, unable to bear it any longer, took me back from him. Just let her rest in peace. "Erick, you can't go on like this. Understand?" But Erick couldn't hear a word of it. About a month later, Erick had lost 30 pounds. He missed all the drama promotions and team events. One day, Paul went to his house to get a contract that was about to expire, only to find an unconscious Erick. There was also a glaring arterial wound on his wrist. And so, year after year, Erick went through treatment and eventually got better. Even his therapist believed he was getting better. But on the night of the award ceremony, Erick's illness returned. After coming off the stage, still in his formal suit, Erick looked at the crowd that had gathered, their faces full of worry. He anxiously touched the scars on his wrist and looked at Paul. "Is there still no news about Lisa?" Chapter 4. There would be no more news about me. At least, that was true for anyone living in a normal world, but Erick wasn't like that. Paul couldn't say it either. He couldn't save someone who was trapped in his own empty world. All Paul could do was take Erick home, alone, like he had done for the past 10 years. Like a father caring for his wounded son, no matter the weather, bringing him back to his own place. Tonight, as expected, Erick was once again trending. There were people in the comments who felt regret, sadness, but also those who scolded him, calling Erick crazy, telling him to take his trophy and stop acting if he was mentally ill. Yet, the ones who cherished him outnumbered them. So, the vlogs of Erick and me were once again brought to the forefront by the gossip accounts, and the comments section was filled with tears. Paul instructed the team to calm the fans down first and arranged for a psychologist to be at Erick's small apartment tomorrow morning, ready to support him. That apartment had been there for over a decade, and Erick, Being someone with deep emotions and sentimental attachment had never changed it. No matter how much money he had. The other room was locked with all my belongings inside. According to local customs, my personal items were supposed to be burned and cremated. But Erick refused. And after everything that happened, the room just remained locked. The lock itself had begun to rust. Later that night, after Paul had settled everything, he handed Erick a new script, only as a way to console him. He knew it was a terrible, cliché drama, and with Erick's sharp eye for roles, he would surely dismiss it. Paul had used this method countless times. He also ordered 2 bowls of duck blood soup. Whenever Erick looked at a script, he would become completely absorbed, regardless of the quality. So, Paul waved his hand in front of Erick's reddened eyes, and those rare, beautiful eyes blinked in a daze, slowly coming back to reality. "Have something to eat," Paul said. Erick was about to shake his head, but then he paused, seemingly remembering something, and smiled. "Paul, I remember Lisa. Yesterday, she was just mad at me because I wasn't eating well." Paul was used to it, used to how Erick's subconscious would blur or confuse timelines. But it was always, without exception, about me. His throat tightened as he faked a hearty laugh. "Then you need to listen to her. If you don't, she'll stay upset for a long time." That night, a warm smile spread through Erick's eyes as he silently ate his meal, bite by bite. After finishing, he put down the superficial script, stood up, and put on his jacket. Paul dozed off for a moment, only to be startled awake by alarms blaring. "Erick, where are you going?" The assistants hired for Erick were on duty 24/7, always by his side, and there were always at least 3 of them. At this award show, Paul had insisted on taking on the duty himself. Erick paused as he put on his jacket, then smiled lightly. "Why are you so nervous?" "I can't go out during the day. It's too crowded. Now it's quiet. I just wanted to buy a gift for Lisa. Her birthday is coming up." Paul stammered in his nervousness, his words clumsy. But do you remember what you said at the awards today?" "What?" Erick tried to recall. After a moment, he answered, "We won an award for daylight revelry, right?" It seemed his condition had recently gotten worse. Paul considered whether he should stop Erick from working for a while. So he lied again. "Why don't we wait until tomorrow when we're back in Shanghai? She likes having you with her. And you know she always complains your gifts are too much like a typical guy's, right?" Out of muscle memory, Erick soon smiled. He remembered the first time we were together, when Erick bought me a set of 128 color eyeshadows, all the colors, very expensive, and shaped like a lotus. I laughed out of exasperation back then. The second time, he improved and got me daisies. Yeah, I never expected to be gone that year. Later on, when he got busier with filming, I told him there was no need to pick gifts for me anymore. It was too much. So Erick stopped buying gifts. He was sensitive and meticulous, so he found a middle ground. Whenever we went shopping together, I'd tiptoe, wrap my arms around his neck, and praise him. "This is good, buddy. I really like it." Erick would always smile, unable to hide it. At my teasing tone, he was probably at his most romantic when he prepared the proposal. He oversaw every tiny detail in secret, inviting all our friends and family to Milan. Everything was ready, except for one thing. I died at the airport. The wind blew, carrying the smell of blood, and I had no time to fully register the pain. My breaths were etched deep, down to my bones, as I felt myself fading away. I thought, how rebellious I am, why did I have to fight? But then, in that brief flash, I also thought about that child. What was his fault in all this? He was so young, just like Erick once was, helpless and vulnerable. Chapter 5. It feels as though death has turned my life into a documentary. I returned to the moment when Erick and I went to the police, watching him barefoot, his small body leaving a trail of blood with each step. He couldn't see clearly, stumbled along, and finally collapsed in the shadow of a willow tree that year. I showed up wearing a princess dress. The panic in my expression happened to be the last thing Erick saw before he lost consciousness. His breathing was labored. His battered hand, faintly revealing bone, trembled as he tried to touch my foot but failed, closing his eyes instead. My parents followed me out in a rush, covering their mouths in shock at the sight. Later, The sound of police cars blared as Erick was taken to the hospital for treatment. His father, Nestor, anxiously rubbed his palms together, drunkenly bowing before the police, pleading, "Officer, I won't do it again. I was just drunk and causing trouble." The policeman's face darkened with anger. "Trouble? You beat your own child until the bones showed?" Maybe because of Nestor's connections, the officer tried to stay composed. He leaned down and looked at Nestor with utter disgust, lowering his voice to say, "The child had 5 nails driven into his waist. You people are monsters. A disgrace as parents." Nestor wept, bowing his head repeatedly, but it was of no use. 5 months later, Erick's wounds had mostly healed. That day, my parents prepared a clean, spacious room for him, full of plush toys and a newly installed TV. The doorbell rang, and Dad took my hand to open the door. Mom, wearing a dress, rushed over, having just finished setting the table with aromatic chicken. Outside, the sky was clear and bright. Erick stood there, with a backpack and a shabby suitcase, nervously gripping the strap of his bag. His eyelids were thin, and the veins were visible. He opened his mouth, trying to say something, but no words came out. Dad smiled as he took the suitcase. "Erick, welcome to our family." Erick told me he remembered that moment for his entire life. Countless times, in the dead of night, when he'd recall the painful memories from his original family, he'd wake up drenched in cold sweat. Then, he'd look at all the plush toys, pulling one into his arms. He would think, "How wonderful, I'm not alone anymore." But somehow, after everything, it seems Erick is alone once again. When Paul woke up, he rubbed his throbbing head and yawned. Just as he was about to drink some water, he noticed Erick's room was empty. His mind went blank. He rushed to find his phone, silenced at 7 a.m., only to see 23 missed calls. Realizing his absence, the assistant had also sent a screenshot and a video. Screenshot: Erick back on trending topics. The video shows Erick, dressed in pajamas, barefaced, standing in a strange Times Square. He's holding a photo, politely asking random passers-by, one by one, "Excuse me, have you seen Lisa? Could you tell me if Lisa went to Milan?" "Lisa? Yes. She's my fiancé. Do you know her?" The star effect attracted countless people, and the crowd was impenetrable. Erick stood there, bewildered, his pale lips pressed together, and for once, he got angry. He was a humble, gentle person, and even when angry, all he did was frown. "Please don't block the way. I'm looking for someone." Then, someone in the crowd, unable to contain himself, thought it amusing. "Lisa is dead. You won't find her." The word spread, and people began to shout accusations. Erick, however, froze on the spot. His physical strength had always been extraordinary, and even with his good temper, he couldn't hold back this time. His fierce eyes grabbed the man's collar. His face twisted with rage. "I'm warning you, don't make such tasteless jokes." The environment was chaotic, and all that could be heard was a chorus of cries. Paul's heart ached as if it was being torn apart. The assistant's message popped up at the bottom of the chat. "Paul, this happened near my house. Erick and I are at the police station right now, just wrapping up procedures before heading back." Paul replied, saying all right. By dusk, the assistant knocked on the door, and when it opened, Erick was standing there, holding a massive teddy bear, about 5 feet tall. Paul asked, "What's with the teddy bear?" But Erick was vacant-eyed, his handsome face etched with sharp features, still as warm as always as he introduced it to Paul. "What teddy bear?" "This is Lisa." Paul was stunned. The assistant explained that on the way back, Erick suddenly saw the teddy bear standing outside a gift shop, and couldn't bear to leave it, so he bought it. Paul was speechless. For heaven's sake, if he wanted a castle, would you go buy it for him? Paul felt himself getting heated up, nearly boiling with frustration, and hurriedly packed his luggage, saying, "Quickly, as fast as possible, we need to go back." Chapter 6. Erick's condition was getting worse, and the online debate was intensifying. Paul was running around, almost losing his mind. He wished he could split himself into 8 parts. The psychologist said that Erick's depression hadn't improved in the slightest. It was clearly worse compared to 4 years ago. Paul couldn't help but rub his bald head, losing his temper. Then why couldn't you see it earlier? The man's like this, and you have no sense of responsibility? The doctor pressed his forehead, quite helpless. Erick's condition isn't something recent. It's been going on for years. There's always been an emotional knot in his heart that he can't untie. And you know that. Relying solely on medication is like trying to put out a fire with a cup of water. Paul still wanted to argue, but the doctor, unwilling to engage with someone who didn't fully understand, packed up and left. They had been friends for many years. Make sure Erick eats on time. Terminate all his activities. Keep him under 24-hour surveillance. And be cautious, another suicide attempt isn't out of the question. Paul quickly calmed down. This time, Erick didn't wake up for 3 whole days. When Paul returned to Erick's room, Erick was filming with his camera again. The giant teddy bear was sitting on the sofa. The television was on. Facing the bear, Erick smiled gently. Lisa, why do you always have the same expression? Just as he finished, he felt exhausted again. Carefully and quietly, he lay down on the bed and fell asleep. Paul watched him sleep, and his eyes couldn't help but feel heavy with emotion. He sat by the bed and sighed. Erick, when will you finally wake up? However, the next day when Paul entered the room, it was pitch dark. Erick was still in bed, and hadn't moved at all. Paul was about to open the curtains. Then, a hoarse voice came from the bed. Don't open them. Erick was holding the bear's paw. After being silent for a long time, his throat dry, he spoke again. Paul, have I had another episode? Not exactly. Paul paused, not knowing how to explain the dramatic scene that had unfolded the previous day. Sighing heavily. Yeah, you could say that. Since Erick already knew, there was no point in hiding it any longer. Erick lay with his back to Paul, the room dark. His entire figure seemed to be buried in the despair of an isolated island. This wasn't the Erick he was when Lisa was still around. If everything had been normal, Erick would never have allowed himself to appear so fragile in front of Lisa. But who was he standing tall for? Whom was he trying to protect now? After a long silence, Erick, who had cherished his acting career for almost 10 years, struggled to maintain a calm voice. Paul, I'm not suitable for acting anymore. The words left Paul stunned for a long time. What do you mean? He was taken aback. Explain it more clearly. I don't understand. Erick's voice was as still as a pool of dead water. I'm leaving the industry. Paul shook with rage, gritting his teeth, his eyes wide. He rubbed his bald head and paced around the room. Erick, stop being ridiculous. Paul had been in this industry for so many years and had stayed by Erick's side through it all. Besides Lisa, no one else knew how much Erick loved acting. Where's your ambition? Back then, you could portray 5 different emotions for just a 5-scene extra. After becoming famous, you went on to make art films, and when big directors wanted you for their high-budget movies, you didn't even look at them. You spent your days tirelessly reading scripts, and now you're telling me you're not suitable? Paul felt like his world was falling apart. All those messy idol stars are alive and kicking, but why can't Erick, who's dedicated to his craft, keep going? Is being an award-winning actor too much to handle? However, Erick accepted everything in silence, closing his eyes calmly. Paul, I'm sick. Just those few words left Paul speechless, his lips moving without sound. Finally, he could only say, with tears welling in his eyes, you can still get better, Erick. At this moment, Erick's vulnerability was plain to see. I can't get better. How can someone walk if they've lost their shoes? Outside the door, Paul leaned against the wall, exhaling deeply from his chest. Then, he looked up, letting the tears fall. He could no longer hold them back, speaking helplessly to the air. Lisa, if you're out there, please help Erick. The assistants rushed over to support him. He shook his head, refusing. Just take care of Erick. His mind had already started figuring out Erick's exit from the entertainment industry. In this world, a person's life is the most important thing. Besides, he couldn't keep this up any longer. Chapter 7. Erick's condition fluctuated, sometimes standing on the balcony staring outside for hours, sometimes sitting there all night. At times, he would hold a large teddy bear and mumble to himself. The house was small, and Paul, being meticulous, had all the windows reinforced and installed a tracking device on Erick. Now, Erick was quiet and obedient, capable of not speaking for an entire day. If no one reminded him, he would even forget to eat. When food spilled onto his clothes, he wouldn't notice, just like an unborn child, confused and ignorant. When he had episodes, he never called for his parents, only for Lisa. One day, while the assistant was cooking, Erick suddenly appeared in the kitchen doorway. Smiling, the assistant looked at him, holding back his emotions and smiling. "Brother Erick, why are you so happy? Is there good news?" Erick acted like a normal person. He sighed softly, and a smile played on his lips. "Lisa complained that I wasn't eating well and went to the airport. I'm going to propose to her tomorrow. And tonight, brother, we're all flying to Milan together." The assistant was a die-hard fan of Erick. Though he hadn't been with him for long, he had learned that Erick was a good person inside and out, even when he was sick. He never pretended otherwise. Erick never had an air of superiority, always approachable and kind. The assistant sniffled, holding back tears, and smiled naturally. "All right, brother, then eat a few more bowls of rice today." Erick nodded and agreed. That night, Erick forgot about going to Milan again. He rarely had a moment of clarity and, at 9 o'clock, called Paul over. The two sat across from each other in the living room. Erick seemed to be in a good mood and looked surprised at the stack of documents Paul had brought. "Is there really this much?" Paul's mood was the opposite, so he spoke sarcastically. "What do you think, Erick? The great actor? Where could you find another 32-year-old Chinese actor recognized globally? A popular, beloved talent?" Erick found it amusing, shaking his head without saying anything. Late at night, the two talked until they were both exhausted. Erick stared at his 70 million followers on Weibo and at the forever pinned video. Lost in thought, Paul knew he couldn't let go and patted his shoulder. "All right, you go ahead and post the retirement announcement. Pick a normal working hour. The marketing accounts and the publicity staff need their rest too." Erick responded with a sound from his throat. In the end, the endorsement penalties were paid, and the accounts for all these years were settled clearly. Paul only took a tenth of the salary for himself. The night was too quiet, with cicada calls coming from all directions. The wind was strong, and the weather forecast said there would be a heavy storm tomorrow. At the farewell, Erick, who was always afraid of the cold, stood on the steps and suddenly looked at Paul's bald head and smiled. Paul noticed his gaze and jokingly glared at him. "You ungrateful brat. What are you staring at me for?" Unexpectedly, Erick looked at him deeply and said softly in the silent night, "Paul, you know, you're really kind of like my dad." He added, "I mean, a regular dad." Paul didn't take it to heart, treating it as a compliment. "All right." With those words, it was all worth it. The next moment, Erick bear hugged him, and before Paul could react, they had already separated. Erick, who was much skinnier now, patted Paul's shoulder, just like Paul used to do to him, and joked, "Go, just treat it all as a dream." Paul got goosebumps, pressed the car key, and also joked, "Get lost. Hurry up and post the statement. Otherwise tomorrow the paparazzi will have a field day." Watching Paul leave, Erick returned to the house without Lisa. The silence was so overwhelming that it made it hard to breathe. Shortly after returning to the couch, as expected, his assistant came in to check on him, unable to feel at ease. An hour later, Erick thoughtfully finished posting his retirement statement. Late at night, Erick pretended to be in one of his episodes, silent and dazed, eventually lying down to sleep. He was a natural actor, closing his eyes tightly and controlling his breathing rhythm so that people would feel reassured and turn away. Soft conversations echoed in the hallway. "Remember to bring Erick's medication in 2 hours." Another hour later, the assistant, who felt reassured, tucked Erick in and left. Erick was lying on his side, half of his face buried in the pillow. 2 hours later, the assistant came in with the medication. Following procedure, he softly called Erick's name, but this time, no matter how much he called, Erick wouldn't wake up. By daylight, the news that Erick had committed suicide by slitting his wrists at home broke. People left comments. "Liar. I tell you, Whoever spreads rumors deserves death. I don't believe it. This has to be fake, right? Then, a video of Paul rushing to the hospital at dawn in the storm, falling in the rain, quickly made it to the trending lists on major platforms. In the video, Paul covered his face, crying uncontrollably. The man in his 50s, at this moment, didn't even have the strength to walk. Now everyone believed it. Following the news of Erick's suicide, at 10 o'clock in the morning, a scheduled message from Erick was posted, announcing his retirement from the entertainment industry. He had updated his Weibo homepage with a new pinned post. Friends, I'm going to find Lisa. Don't be sad. This rain is your farewell to me. The next day, as the drizzle began to stop, countless fans, their eyes red from crying, came to Erick's house holding daisies. Initially, the security guards tried to stop them, but later Paul, his voice hoarse, said, "No need." Erick always loved his fans. Let them say their goodbyes. Perhaps it was mercy from the heavens. As the rain continued on and off for a whole month, on the day the skies cleared and a rainbow appeared, Paul posted a message on his social media. "Kid, you've reunited with Lisa, haven't you?